Some of them have left the church altogether, sometimes very vocally, because they disagreed with fill in the blank on whatever it is. And some of them, we just don't know where they are. They're missing in action. And I think part of the reason that feels more difficult in this season than it would in any other time is because for many of us, we're taking that very personally because we haven't just lost volunteers. In a lot of cases, we've lost friends.
Welcome. You're listening to The Glass House, hosted by Lifeway. We're Ben and Lindley Mandrell, and we have conversations with leaders who have experienced the stress of ministry and have sensed a spotlight on their personal lives. We want to encourage ministry families and provide a glimpse inside their glass house. And before we start this episode, I want to invite you to participate in the conversation. If you have feedback to offer, a general question for Lindley or me, or if there's a topic you'd like for us to tackle in the future, email us at president@lifeway.com. We read every one of those emails. Welcome to this episode of The Glass House. Today, we have a relevant subject. According to Lifeway research, pastors are saying that the number one frustration they feel through this COVID season is a lack of commitment among church members. Pastors are frustrated because they feel like they're giving it their all, their wives are giving it everything they've got, but yet people are kind of flaky, kind of opting in, opting out. So how do you get people more connected to the church so it's a healthier atmosphere? And the answer really is service. As people serve, they get more connected and involved in their church. Lindley, this is a huge passion point for you. When we were church planners, your favorite thing was to plug people into service.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to find unusual places of service. I think we were talking about that even in there I think that churches get stagnant in being creative with places for them to serve. But I mean, for me, I was so desperate for so many volunteers and just for help. And so, what I mentioned in there was, there was a lady that helped clean the rooms. Well, she would come in every Friday morning and clean baby toys. I had another mom who would do that as well and help, and she'd bring her 3-year-old son. And then I had a lady who she had 5 children and she wanted to be serving in the kids area, but she also wanted a break. And so on Sunday mornings when her kids were in Sunday school, she came and wrote postcards to new families, visiting families. And we had a template that she followed, but it was handwritten, it wasn't typed. And so, she felt like she was giving in that regard.
The issue is so relevant, and the guest that we have today, Danny Franks, who's the pastor of guest services at the Summit Church in Raleigh, Durham, he has just a winsome way of talking about it, why we need people to serve, but also why we shouldn't feel bad about calling them to places of service. It's really a great conversation. So, Danny, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be with you.
Well, Lindley and I are excited about this conversation because we know in both the churches we have served that this was one of the biggest sources of stress in the church of we need help.
Right.
Can we just start with where do you think things are with COVID and just fatigue and people losing volunteers? Like, what are you hearing out there?
I think I'm hearing everything that everyone else is hearing, that we are we're in a spot that we've just simply never been in before. I don't know that I know of any church leader who would say that they've ever had enough volunteers, but especially in the last several months as we've begun to gather again, we just find ourselves in a completely different situation than ever before. And I think one of the things that makes this season so different and so difficult is that we're just looking at completely different reasons that volunteers are no longer with us. Some of them maybe don't feel comfortable coming back yet. They're still doing some version of virtual church. Some of them have left the church altogether, sometimes very vocally because they disagreed with fill in the blank on whatever it is. And some of them, we just don't know where they are. They're missing in action. And I think part of the reason that feels more difficult in this season than it would in any other time is because for many of us, we're taking that very personally because we haven't just lost volunteers. In a lot of cases, we've lost friends. We've lost people that we've invested life in. We've lost people that we thought we might be doing ministry with until the day that we die. And so there's a very personal element of hurt in the middle of that.
I want you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
We haven't just lost volunteers, we've lost friends.
Mhm.
That has been a theme along this podcast of just, it hurts when we not only have lost the help, but we've lost the camaraderie and the friendship that came along with that. How are you coaching your leaders through that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it. I mean, if we're talking about relationships, then discovering the answer in the middle of this really does all rise and fall on the relationship. And so, I coach our team as much as they can, as much as it's within their power to find out why. Like, what's the situation? Which category are you in? If we don't know that they've left the church, can we find that out? If we don't know that they're just simply watching virtually and they're not ready to come back in person yet, can we know that? Have they come back and they're fine to be in a worship setting, but they're not fine to serve? Because I think a lot of times we tend to fill in the blanks for other people. We tend to make a lot of assumptions on why they are serving, haven't come back, are back in service and not serving yet. But I think until we have those conversations and we hear them out, not to win a point, but to hopefully win back the friendship or maintain the friendship, we really can't make a lot of sweeping assumptions about the state of our team.
It's really good.
When you say you're training your staff to find that out. I mean, my personality, when you say that, I would get on the phone and call them. I know that's really hard for people to do sometimes. I mean, what are you telling them to do specifically to find that out besides just call them? Because I know there are people out there who would be like, I can't call them. That makes me nervous or whatever.
Yeah, well, actually, that's one of the things that we did, like many churches did, back at the very beginning of the pandemic. Our goal was to call every single person who was a part of an attendee of the church. And so, every single campus, every single ministry leader, all of us were calling and just checking in and seeing how people were doing. And at first, it wasn't in an attempt to figure out where you are, as far as on our volunteer team, because we didn't have any volunteer teams in action. It was simply just to catch up with them. But I think that actually really gave a lot of credibility to those leaders who were making those phone calls during that season, because it was not a phone call to see what else can you do for us during this season. It was what do you need and what can we do for you. So yeah, it was a call. After that, leaders were doing everything from phone calls to just email blasts every week, video updates on what was going on in the ministry and what our timelines were. But we were trying to keep that as much as we could to a very small scale, so people were hearing from the leaders that they worked alongside and weren't just getting like an all church blast. We were trying to help those team members know what was going on as we began to get back closer to times for them to be able to come back and serve again.
So you guys really push towards the phone call and not the email because the email is so much easier, but it's also easier to ignore.
That's exactly right. That's right. And obviously there are times that the email was
Sure.
necessary because we couldn't get in touch with them any other way. But it's something about getting on the phone and hearing someone's voice that I think made a lot of difference for a lot of our people, volunteers and non-volunteers during that season.
My friend Gary Hollingsworth says that trust travels on the highway of relationships. And a healthy volunteer ministry is all about building healthy relationships with those who serve. I know when we served in the local church together, it was that personal phone call, that personal connection that really was the thing that put people on the roster to sign up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people, half of the reason they're serving is that they want a connection with their leader. That's not all the reason, but they want to form connections in the church, and so when they sign up to serve in your ministry, they don't want to always just receive an email of through Planning Center of their times. They want a connection with you, and I know even for our church situation, I mean, walking around and talking to the volunteers on a Sunday morning, when we were have kids ministry leaders and just saying thank you eye to eye, face to face was always more effective than having a room where they could come and get a snack because they're not there for a snack. They're there for relationships. And so, to to just look them in the eyes and say thank you. And I know this is a sacrifice. It seemed to put a lot of change in their pockets.
If someone is serving in your ministry and they've been there 3 or 4 times and you don't know more about them than the first week they showed up, that's a problem. That relationship that's building is part of the trust and the ministry atmosphere that you're creating.
It's not a problem if you want them to leave.
That's right.
I mean, they leave because they're going to go find a different ministry to where they do feel like somebody cares about them.
As senior pastor, I noticed that those who oversaw volunteers had the highest temptation for being resentful.
Yes.
It really is hard when you're trying to put together a program and on Saturday night, person after person says, hey, we've decided to stay out of town, won't be there tomorrow.
Mhm.
How do you overcome that in ministry to not take it personally when
Yeah.
that happens?
Yeah. Ben, it's hard because I think sometimes we tend to uh, tend to assume that we never do those kind of things to other people when in fact we do. And I do think it's funny with volunteers when you get a text first thing on Sunday morning that says, hey, I woke up this morning and we're inexplicably at the beach. Much of a surprise to us as anybody else. It's like nobody plans for vacation anymore. They just sort of teleported there. And so there can be, when that happens time after time after time, we see that as a collective whole. When for that particular volunteer, they may not be a repeat offender when it comes to things like that, and it really was just a one-off thing. But we tend to treat every situation like a collective whole, and I think the only answer to that, well, two answers to that. Number one, obviously, is show the same grace that you've been given in so many situations like that. But number two is to just think very proactively about it. If you ever have a weekend where every single volunteer shows up, then you may not have a team that has enough volunteers on that because you can. I think that we need to create teams that are constantly overstaffed, knowing that we're always going to have a volunteer who's going to be sick, they're not going to show up, whatever it is, and that helps to calm us a little bit more when things don't go exactly according to our plans.
Do you have any stories about conflict with volunteers that you could
None.
share?
None
Never
whatsoever.
had any.
I've never had one bit of conflict. As a matter of fact, I just a little bit earlier today gave the eulogy at a funeral of one of our longtime volunteers, a sweet, sweet 85-year-old lady, who was kind of like everybody's surrogate grandmother. She was sweet as they came. Every week you'd get a hug, you'd get a kiss on the cheek, and you were sugar or baby. Until the one weekend that I failed because she was part of one of my teams, and I failed to communicate something to her that she needed to know in order to do her job. And at that point, I was no longer sugar or baby. I was Danny, and I knew that if I was being called by my actual name, that I was in a lot of trouble.
Ooh.
She let me know exactly what she thought about my failure to communicate over something that she felt was very important, and it was important. And she let me know exactly what she thought about me there for a few minutes. And it wasn't that much later. I mean, it was later that morning that she was able to calm down. I was able to, apologize effectively and sufficiently, I think, to her. I still remember taking a walk down the sidewalk of us just kind of talking it out with one another. Um, but I think in those situations, in that situation in particular, I was the one that was responsible for that conflict because I failed to communicate with her. But I think in that we can either withdraw to our corners and like so many of us are used to doing these days, and just continue to villainize the other person, or we can come together to apologize where necessary, repent where it's needed, and try to restore again that relationship, so that the volunteer feels like you do see them as a person.
I think there's ownership on both sides in this. I think the leaders need to be willing to admit fault. I think also if you're listening and you're a volunteer and you're really upset about something, chances are maybe your leader doesn't even realize it. Maybe they don't realize they didn't communicate something effectively. Maybe an email went out that sounded differently than it did in his or her mind. And so, I just would issue a challenge here to the volunteers as well to, um, we would say, can we check an assumption? Ben and I have that saying, can we check an assumption? And if you're assuming that they know, they may not. And so maybe reach out to them and just say, have I offended you? Have I messed up here? So,
Several things here. I think it's not only a matter of if, but when you're going to have conflict with volunteers because you're doing life together and relationships are going to collide. But second of all, I think it's important to recognize that Danny was paying attention to know that she wasn't calling him by his term of endearment. There's a lot of leaders that aren't even self-aware enough to know that somebody's even upset. A big part of relationships is just recognizing, hey, our relationship has cooled, something has happened, let's talk about it. When you're constantly running from room to room and you're overly committed to too many things, you stop doing those little conversations that keep the environment healthy. But to your point, when those moments happen and there is a disagreement, music to the ears of a volunteer is when a staff member says, I didn't handle that well. It just wins the day. And when a leader like Danny comes and says, hey, I could have communicated that better, I didn't, I'm sorry, that moment they get closer, not further away from one another. And that's what intimacy is all about, is getting closer through the conflict and not avoiding it. What do you see in the church as far as church leaders, church staff? Do they see the need for volunteers, or how do you coach up churches who are still, everybody's stressed out because there's not enough help?
Yeah, I do think that oftentimes we are inadvertently responsible for that as leaders, whether we want to admit it or not.
Hmm.
Because I don't know of any leader that doesn't have at least something inherent in them that has a little bit of a superhero syndrome. We do the work of the ministry because we love the work of the ministry. And that's fine. We should love the work of the ministry, but Ephesians also commands us to equip the saints for the work of the ministry.
Hmm.
Our pastor says oftentimes that when he became a pastor, he got out of the ministry because that now his job is to equip others to do that work. And I think that there's a lot of times where we create a lack of volunteers because we have such a tight fist on the way that we think things ought to be done, that we don't raise up volunteers who may not do it as good as we think that we can. But if they can do it 70, 80% as well, then why not hand that over to them so that our attention can go somewhere else and we can put that energy into equipping them for that work.
Do you find that some of it's kind of ego driven?
Oh, absolutely, it's ego driven. I at least know for the guy that is in my mirror, it is ego driven, and I know that I still would consider myself a recovering micromanaging control freak, because I just always assume that I know exactly how this thing ought to run. I know what it looks like in my mind, but the problem with that is anytime that I get in that very blind spot thinking, I bottleneck the ministry for everybody else. And I'm not equipping other people to be able to do what God has called them to do, how He's wired them. And in very, very few cases have I ever legitimately handed something over to someone who is gifted. Not just handing over to anyone, but gifted in that particular area, that it didn't end up better than I would have been able to do it because they had the time, the bandwidth, the passion, and for me to hold control over that just means that I'm robbing them of that opportunity to serve.
so you said you're a recovering micromanager. So for another person out there listening that may be starting to realize that they're trying to do it all, we had a guest on here at one time that said she was over functioning. For that person, what are some practical steps to start delegating, to start handing off, and really just even using the body of Christ the way it should be used? I mean, that's the beauty of serving, is that you have all these people in the church who have these gifts, and that's what we learn biblically. But then we don't empower them to use their gifts, because what if they don't do it exactly like we wanted to do it?
I think the first thing is just to realize that as perfect as we think that we are in whatever we're executing, there is absolutely zero perfection that is present in anything that we do. So just to acknowledge that and know that. I think a second thing is for us to give our team permission to call us out when it's necessary. Maybe not every single person on your team, but if there's a trusted group of volunteers who are in leadership that you are pouring your life directly into, three or four of those, they know that about you anyway. My team knows about me anyway that I am a recovering micromanaging control freak, and they know that when those things begin to rise up, that they not only have permission to call me out, but they have a mandate to call me out on that, because I'm not allowing them to do the job that God has called them to do. And then I think if there's a third thing, it is simply just to sit back, take your hands off of it. It doesn't mean that you abandon the project. You're still there for advice and counsel and coaching when they ask you for it. But if you've given a very clear vision, very clear guardrails of we can't go beyond this, but just try it, to let a project go through to completion without holding on to every little thing, and see how that volunteer does. And at the end of it, if the event or the project or the ministry doesn't go off to the grandest success ever, well, that's not an overall loss. It's a teaching opportunity to go back and debrief and figure out how do we make it better the next time. But even then, it's a lot of asking them the question, how do you think this could go better the next time? Not you giving all of your input, and really kind of breaking them down in the process.
I think there's pressure on ministry leaders for their ministry to shine, and anyone I put into place that may not shine is a reflection upon me.
Hmm.
I do think for ministry leaders, it's really hard to hand stuff off because at the end of the day, we lose some praise, we lose some
Yeah,
applause, and somebody else is going to get some of that credit. And that's where
right.
the soul searching piece, I think, comes in.
But think about the flip side of that, though. Think about what a testimony it is to the Lord's work in our life and our own humility when we are investing that work and that equipping in other people's lives, so that they are, when I say getting the praise, when you say getting the praise, we mean that obviously in a healthy way. But our mutual friend Todd Atkins says that nobody ever got fired for raising up rock stars. And when we are investing in other people in such a way that they are able to grow in the giftings that God has put in their life, then that's a win for us as leaders, even if we weren't the ones who were directly doing those things.
Because our listeners are not just church staff, we have a lot of folks listening who just are interested in the conversation. Sometimes it's hard to convince people that they need to serve in the church.
Mhm.
They're happy just to come, get a sermon, maybe meet a few people in the hallway, perhaps be a part of a small group, but getting people to serve. Danny, how do you motivate them to do that?
Yeah, one of the things that the phrases that we use around here a lot is when it comes to serving, we don't ask you to serve because we need you to serve, but because you need to serve.
Mm.
If you're a follower of Jesus, if you're a disciple, part of your identity as a disciple is that you are a servant. Jesus said, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many." And so when we serve, we're modeling one of the aspects of Jesus's character. When we serve, we're using the gifts that we have been given by God. We're fulfilling what 1 Peter 4:10 says, that each has received a gift, and as we have received it, we're to use it as good stewards of God's varied grace. And so when we don't serve, I think one of the ways that we could interpret 1 Peter 4:10 is that, if by serving we are displaying God's varied grace, then by not serving, uh, it's quite possible that there is an aspect of God's grace that is not fully revealed in the local church, because we're not serving as a steward of that grace. So for people who are not serving, and I want to be clear, when I say serve, I don't mean always serving on the parking team or rocking babies in the nursery. That's not always service. Is on just on the weekend. Plenty of times that you can serve in pregnancy support service during the middle of the week, or whatever it is, and you're still fulfilling that call to serve. But I think for all of us as believers, it is it's a mandate, and it is something that if we don't do it, we do it to our detriment. Because honestly, bored Christians tend to be critical Christians,
Mm.
and so we want to be really careful that we are helping people to fulfill the call that God has placed on their lives.
I have a question with your church in particular, or you may have good experience from different ones. Besides the pastor's all call from the pulpit, like what are some good ways to recruit volunteers that you guys have learned or, maybe figured out?
Yeah. Well, I hope you don't get a lot of unsubscribes from my answer, but I would argue that an all call from the pulpit is one of the least effective ways that we recruit
Amen.
No, we
volunteers.
agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have all been in churches where the best game on Sunday morning is beat the pastor to the pulpit with a little post-it note or a ripped off corner of the bulletin with your announcement scribbled on there. Because if you can get that prime real estate of 5 minutes before the sermon, then that's gonna answer all of the volunteer woes that you will ever have. But what we recognize is that stage announcements create awareness, but they often do not create action.
It's good.
And so when you hear something being announced from the stage about a need, one of two things is going to happen. Either someone in the congregation is going to say, "Oh yes, I'll do that," because they've also said, "Oh yes, I'll do 17 other things," and they say yes to everything because they have a low level of guilt that they always need to be doing something. And those volunteers typically will burn out because they are doing it all. The other response is that somebody will be sitting there and go, that sounds like a great opportunity for that guy over there. And so they create a lot of awareness, but they don't often create effective action. And so I think a better response to that is to recognize that yes, it's always going to be staff's responsibility to continually invite volunteers into the mission, but it's also volunteers' responsibility to continually invite volunteers into the mission. And so Tim Stevens and Tony Morgan talk about this in terms of shoulder tapping. We need to train our people how to shoulder tap their friends, their circles of influence, and help them to get involved in the mission because they'll give them a yes a lot of times quicker than they'll give us a yes.
That's really good.
Mhm.
I think there's a pastor and wife out there listening to this episode. They're probably small to medium sized church pastors, leaders of the church, and they're generalists. Like they're called to do everything. They have very few staff,
Mhm.
but they recognize this is a huge issue. They keep year after year trying to do it all. What would you say to them?
Yeah, and I would even add to that, they may have actually been told before in not so many words, this is what we pay you to do.
Yes.
And I think that if Ephesians is true, if our role is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, then we have to recognize. Well, first of all, we've got to recognize that we are not the sum total of the success of our volunteer teams. We are not the grace of God on our lives does not rise and fall on how many of our volunteers came back after the pandemic. We are loved by God, period, on the basis of what Jesus did for us on the cross, and that's where we find our full acceptance in Him. But that still doesn't eliminate all of that pain. For a pastor's wife who is kind of struggling through these things. So I would I would want to have a couple of really trusted friends that I could process through those things with and talk about the things that are really hurting when volunteers don't come back, when they suddenly jump ship or whatever. But I would also want to have a lot of conversations with people who don't feel like that they have anything to give to the church. Again, calling out some of those giftings that you feel like God has placed on their life. Conversations with people who feel like they've put in their time and they've served for a lot of years, and they're going to just kind of sit back and let others serve them. I don't think we get a retirement plan in the this side of heaven when it comes to serving in the kingdom. And then just helping people be creative and think through what are the things that you're passionate about, and what could happen in order to catalyze that into a viable ministry. Maybe not something that the church owns, but something that the church catalyzes or blesses, and that might open an entirely new door that you don't necessarily have anything to do with, but you let the spark that might have begun that conversation.
It's been my experience that serving shoulder to shoulder with people actually creates a glue that's even far more powerful than conversation. You're doing something meaningful together.
Mhm.
Would you say that many Christians just miss that opportunity because they don't see it right?
Absolutely, and I'll even give you some data to back that up. We do every year. We do a survey of the congregation just to get a snapshot of that one weekend. Who's here? Who's in a small group? Who's serving? Like we can pull a lot of that data from database or whatever. But just to be able to get a snapshot of the weekend. But it's what we do as a part of that survey is we ask a series of what we call basically emotional connection
Mm.
questions. It's not listed that way on the survey, but things like I feel like I can clearly articulate the mission and vision of the church. I feel like I can help other people to get involved in ministry at the church. I feel like there's 6 or 7 questions that we would list. And when we take those questions and we isolate the data for people who are only in a small group, because I'm like you, Ben, I would have always said that that was the number one indicator of someone's involvement with and connection with the church is that they're in a small group. But when we isolate that data versus those who are only on a ministry team, it's actually those who are on the ministry team that have about a 76 to 80% likelihood of being able to answer all of those connection questions in the
Mm.
affirmative. And the small group would be somewhere in the high 60s, low 70s. Now, obviously, when they're in a small group and on a ministry team, those numbers just skyrocket through the roof. But we were all of us the first year that we did that congregational survey, and that stat came back. I think we were all pretty floored because we assumed it would be small group, but it was actually a ministry team meant that they were more involved, and that stat has proven true year over year.
You talked about superhero syndrome. I'd like to ask another question on that. I think that's a subject matter that doesn't get a lot of airtime in the church because in the church, we do find some of our greatest moments of approval and affirmation from others. And if I hand off this gift, I've lost the most important thing in my life, which is my approval. How do you coach even your ministry leaders to get beyond themselves and really get serious about multiplying their influence?
Mm-hmm. We just had the conversation on our staff team a couple of weeks ago about great quote by Ludwig von Zinzendorf, a count from previous days, who his famous quote is "Preach the gospel, die and be forgotten." And I think that if there is one thing that we always want to talk about leaving a legacy. But do we ever stop to think about what kind of a legacy are we building for the Church of Jesus?
Mm.
Not even necessarily our local church that we have invested in, but the capital C church. And if our name never makes it into a book, either on the cover or as a footnote, if we are not talked about in church growth conferences or whatever, if we are faithfully serving and just doing that long haul over the years, I think that's where faithfulness really comes into play. And I believe that so many times we do want to make a name for ourselves, but we don't want to
Mm.
remember the name that we're serving, because if we do that, then it can't be all about us. It has to be all about Jesus.
It is humbling, isn't it, to think that 25 years from now, people who attend Summit will have no idea who Danny Franks is. It's humbling, isn't
Oh,
it?
there's plenty of people now that have no idea, which I'm kind of okay with.
But you have worked so hard to create a culture there. Your fingerprints are all over the place. But when it's all said and done, none of that matters.
That's right.
What matters is the culture you've created that will continue after you, which is a culture of volunteer engagement and letting people find their gifts for the glory of God.
Yeah, yeah. I had my student pastor growing up who had a profound impact on my life. One of the statements that he always said was, "The greatest test of my ministry has nothing to do with what happens while I'm here. It has everything to do with what happens after I leave." And that was just his way of saying that if he was not investing in and raising up new leaders, then he had really failed at his job.
When Danny discusses J.D. Greer's philosophy of when I was called into the ministry, I left the ministry, he's appealing to Ephesians 4, where pastors are called to equip the church for the work of the ministry. And that really is the best mindset for pastors and church leaders, and to always be thinking about who could take this job? How do I work myself out of a job? And so I can be freed up to go and do and create something new while they now have the joy of leading this ministry. It's so much easier to talk about that than it is to truly hand things off in the church when it may not get done just like you've been doing it.
One of the things to celebrate is when a ministry leader is gone on a Sunday and things go off without a hitch. I mean, I think that should be one of the most celebrated things because that means you have equipped volunteers to be able to handle your absence. And so if you're a leader, a ministry leader listening to this, and you get stressed to leave on a Sunday because who's going to do X, Y, and Z, I mean, you maybe need to look inward and think, I need to begin equipping more volunteers because I should be able to step away and things should run smoothly.
If you're building a ministry around your unique gifts and personality, that thing is headed toward disaster. And the sooner you can start to address that, the better. Everybody should be thinking, who's next? Who's next? If something happens to me, who's next? But it rarely gets talked about in the church because we celebrate the person that's trying to do it all. Last question. Because we know a lot of our listeners are tired from COVID, they're hanging on by a thread, they're believing it's going to get better. Maybe there's somebody out there that's on church staff and man, they're just done. They just feel like they're done. They don't have anything left in the tank. You've coached a lot of people through burnout. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I'll start the answer by quoting a non-Christian book, but one of my favorite books called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, where they talk about looking for the bright spots. When you're in the middle of a hard season of change, look for the bright spots. Last weekend, I was talking to a friend who, pre-COVID, the volunteer team that he leads had about 125 people that were on his volunteer roster actively serving. Since coming back from COVID, they have 9 of those original 125 who have actually come back. Now, again, some of them are attending church. They're just not serving on the team. And as we were talking, and I was kind of, listening to the hurt that was coming out of that, he continued to bring up, this new volunteer and that new volunteer. And what I realized is that the greatest gift for him in this moment, in this season, is to look for that bright spot and to realize that God is still raising up new volunteers. No, it may not be the 125 that you had, but He's bringing new work in, and regardless of the situation. And I recognize there are some incredibly painful situations that I cannot even begin to understand, but God is still doing work. There are still things that are happening in the kingdom of God. He has not been caught off guard by any of this, and He is still raising up people for the sake of the kingdom and for the sake of the ministry, and we get to be a part of that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Glass House. We would love to include you in the conversation. If something stuck out to you in today's episode, let us hear from you, or a topic you'd love to see us tackle in the future, or just any question you want to fire at Lindley and me. Email us at president@lifeway.com.
The Glass House is hosted by Lifeway, executive produced by Joy Almond, produced and edited by Angie Elkins Media, original music by Robert Elkins, sound engineering by Dale Sandberg, and artwork by Cameron Spooner.